Our last lecture was devoted to pragmatics of conjunction, and we followed the relevance theoretic analysis of sentences conjoined by means of and. And according to this analysis, the implicational meanings conveyed by and are interpreted as an enrichment of the propositional content. We've also discussed various types of relations that are implied by and, so first of all cause-consequence relation, and the full range of temporal relations such as containment and simultaneity and overlap and forward sequencing. The only relation that cannot be expressed by the conjuncts is fact explanation. On the other hand, we sort of established that human beings were explanation-seeking creatures, and that when we face juxtaposed sentences, our first procedure in finding the interpretation is just to analyze them as providing a fact and then providing the reason for that fact or some kind of explanation for that fact. And at the end of the lecture we announced certain problems that we considered worth pursuing further, and perhaps today we'll just start from the same problems and then try to find some answers to them. So let us be back to the questions. So why certain relations possible in the juxtaposed cases are not possible in the and conjunctions? Since the bid for explanation of observed and communicated facts is so fundamental, why is the first strategy pursued in the interpretation of juxtaposed sentences precluded from the interpretation of and conjunctions? And can all the precluded relations be understood as cases of explanation? It seems that there is a variety of elaboration relations which can arise between juxtaposed sentences, but not between conjuncts. How are these to be explained? So these are the questions we'll try to address in the following lecture. The claim made by relevance theoretic account is that the second conjunct can never function in an explanatory role to the first conjunct. There are some alternative interpretations, and perhaps we should refer here to one of them, which is called semantic command analysis. And this semantic command analysis, which somehow refers to the syntax of conjoined utterances, assumes that the state of affairs described in the second conjunct can never be understood as the cause of the first conjunct, but because the state of affairs described in the first conjunct is always prior to that described in the second. So in other words, the state of affairs described in the second conjunct cannot precede the state of affairs described in the first conjunct. However, it is a false view because, as you can see in the following interaction, we can just notice a completely different situation. Did John break a vase? Well, the vase broke and John dropped it. So the second utterance here is a conjunction, and the vase broke seems to be the result, and then John dropped it seems to be the cause. However, it is not exactly so. So what we can notice on the basis of this example is that the second conjunct may, in fact, describe the state of affairs that precedes the state of affairs described in the first conjunct. This is true. However, it does not mean that the second conjunct is the explanation for the state of affairs described in the first conjunct. You may notice that B's response involves the assumption that John is somehow responsible for the state of affairs described in the first conjunct. But in fact, the speaker is not explaining to the addressee that John broke a vase. The speaker simply gives the addressee two facts and leaves it to him to do as he likes with them. So as if the speaker proposed two premises, and on the basis of these premises, the addressee is expected to derive the appropriate conclusion. But it is not just the relation between the fact and the explanation of that fact. But in general, we may say that the semantic command analysis makes a false prediction because it excludes the possibility of the second conjunct temporarily prior to the first, okay, which is possible. Now, if we are back to this causal relationship, it also excludes that relation, but in fact, the semantic command analysis does not explain why the conjunct cannot, in fact, express that kind of relationship. So it does not explain the preclusion of the explanatory role in the conjunction. So what we want to show is that there is something about conjunction that makes it impossible to interpret the constituent parts as fact and explanation. So there is a particular feature that makes it different from juxtaposed sentences. And we will try to find this feature. Now, before we do that, I would like to draw your attention to discourse connectives and, again, their behavior in conjunctions. So this is going to be a digression, but it is just to make you notice that, in fact, these discourse connectives that form a uniform group, in a way, behave differently, and this has something to do with the nature of the relationship that the sentences which involve them express. So let's just have a look at discourse connectives. So here they are. So, moreover, furthermore, after all, you see. And Diane Blakemore studied discourse connectives in various contexts, and she noticed a contrast in the acceptability of conjunctions in which these discourse connectives could occur. So if you look at the examples now, the road was icy and she slipped. The road was icy and so she slipped. This is an acceptable sentence. So as you can see, two variants are acceptable, whether they are connected with a discourse connective or not. Now, she's good looking and her father is rich. She's good looking and, furthermore, her father is rich. Again, full acceptability of the two versions. But she slipped and the road was icy, and she slipped and you see the road was icy is not acceptable. This is not a correct sentence. Nor is the following one, she passed the exam, and after all, she's a native speaker. Mind you that if we take out and, then the sentences are fully acceptable. Now, these discourse connectives are understood as directives to the hearer. They form a natural class, and they are non-truth conditional. So what I'm trying to say here is that they form a coherent group. So the question that arises is why they split into two groups when used in an and conjunction. And the point here is that perhaps the first and the second sentence are in a way different than the third and the fourth. Now, if we perhaps concentrate on she slipped and you see the road was icy, and if we just focus on you see, then you will notice that in fact this discourse connective introduces an explanation and is relevant as an answer to the question raised by the first proposition. So she slipped. You see, the road was icy. Okay? So, you see, the road was icy is just the explanation to the possible potential question that might be asked by the addressee after he or she has heard she slipped. Okay? And the same kind of reasoning holds good for the next sentence. So, in fact, sentences 3 and 4 differ from sentences 1 and 2 in that some implicit question may be asked. The road was icy. She slipped. Okay? This is the first sentence. So there is no question. The road was icy. She slipped. This is just a pure consequence of the state of affairs. She's good looking. Her father is rich. Now here you just provide a number of arguments. Okay, so the first one that she's good looking, the second one that her father is rich. But she slipped. The road was icy. Here the relationship is different. So this is the relationship of the explanation. So one more time you can notice that explanation is absolutely precluded from the conjunction. It seems that sentences 1 and 2 are processed in a different way than sentences 3 and 4. In sentences 3 and 4, you make a pause, as if. So first you process she slipped, and then you process you see the road was icy. First you process she passed the exam, and then you process she's a native speaker. Whereas in the case of 1 and 2, they are processed as one unit. The road was icy and she slipped. She's good looking and her father is rich. Again, it appears that the way we process particular utterances is the key to the explanation why certain relations can arise and why certain relations cannot. So let's now perhaps focus on the conjunction, and let's discuss the cognitive effects of a conjunction. So Blakemore claims that when the speaker produces an explicit conjunction, it is a complex conjoined proposition that carries the presumption of optimal relevance and not the constituent propositions individually. So what I'm trying to say is that if a sentence is "it's summer in England and it's winter in New Zealand," the addressee can derive more cognitive effects from the fact that these two are conjoined than he would have derived from two individual sentences that are not conjoined. That is, it's summer in England, it's winter in New Zealand. In other words, there are some good reasons for the speaker to use "and." That is, the speaker believes that there are good reasons for the conjunction, that something more can be derived from the speaker's use of two conjoined utterances than from using two utterances with two individual propositions independently. Okay? So the speaker, for instance, "it's summer in England and it's winter in New Zealand," may want to suggest some kind of contrast. If you look, Max can't read, he's a linguist. Max can read, and he's a linguist. So if I use "and" with a particular prosodic feature, then you can get some additional cognitive effects from my use of "and." And this is that of contrast. So it's summer in England and it's winter in New Zealand, Max can read and he is a linguist, represent symmetric conjunctions. And as you can see, no directional interpretation is involved here. They are of equal importance and you can reverse their order without affecting their meaning. Yet, they have some, or they yield some additional cognitive effects. So as you can see, this additional cognitive effects follow from their being conjoined. And, well, the most obvious effect here is that of contrast. So this is to convince you that our conjunction is a single processing unit. And if it is a single processing unit, then certain additional cognitive effects can be derived from the very fact. Here represented with a conjoined sentence is being required to undertake processing that follows from the lexical and syntactic structure involved in conjoining, and can therefore expect effects that would not follow from the conjuncts taken individually. So, conjunction is to be treated as a single processing unit. Now, mind you that this idea of a single processing unit receives some further support from a number of sentences that you can come across in real life. So if you look at the examples, friends whose kindness and encouragement has been so helpful, for instance, or my hope and wish is to do this or that. That John had an affair and Mary left him is a sad fact. So here, as you can see, kindness and encouragement are two different things, but they are treated as one, and the verb is used in the singular. My hope and wish, again, hope and wish, this is a conjunction, but, again, the verb is singular. That John had an affair and Mary left him is a sad fact. So, as you can see, a conjoined subject or a conjoined phrasal or sentential may function as just one syntactic unit, okay, and may take a singular verb. So this again seems to support the idea that there is such a thing as single processing unit, and that the conjunction of whatever type represents a single processing unit. Further support comes from work in discourse analysis. So a use of and by speakers in the examined group was to signal to hearers that the new utterance was to be understood as the continuation of either the immediately preceding utterance or an earlier one which had been interrupted or sidelined in some way. So, and often displays an upcoming utterance as part of a not yet completed interactional unit. So I've tried to convince you that conjunction should be treated as a single processing unit. And there seems to be further justification for that, because conjunction frequently communicates a chronological sequence of events, and the state of affairs described by the second conjunct is taken as a consequence of the first. But this is something that we can find in real life. This is how we perceive certain facts, certain phenomena are related to each other. He handed her the scalpel and she made the incision. So we may say that there is a real-life scenario in which that sequence of events can be frequently or is commonly found. Now, he left her and she took to the bottle is perhaps less likely to happen, but still possible. This is how events in the real life can relate to each other. She went to the yoga class and found it very calming. And perhaps this is even less typical, but still, since we know that certain state of affairs conjoined by and are related in that way, that is cause, consequence or temporal order, then we are likely to interpret it this way, okay, even if the relationship is not so straightforward as in sentence sentence 1, he handed her the scalpel and she made the incision. Now, the cognitive effects of the conjunction unit crucially hinge on the assumed relations. A particular scenario will be taken as an instance of a more general schema about people working together to perform an operation. for instance. Okay, so the cognitive effects of the conjunctioned unit depend on the assumed relations. So we simply refer to something that we know, that we take for granted, that we've observed many times. So this is what we call a cognitive schema. So as if, in a way, the relations expressed in a conjunction reflect a particular state of affairs in the world. So if certain scenarios repeat in the world all over again, if they are recurrent, okay, then they form cognitive units, and then we can retrieve them from our memory as cognitive units, as entities, self-contained entities. Assuming that schemas, that is sets of related propositions stored together, are cognitive units, we may conclude that in a number of cases, conjunctions map directly onto such units rather than onto individual propositions. Their relevance will lie in the reinforcing effect that they have on the schemas as a whole, and the modification that might introduce to subparts of the schema. So if we are back to the sentence about performing an operation, and if we say she handed him a scalpel and he made an incision, this is reinforcing of the scheme of two people working together, and this him being a surgeon and her being a nurse. But obviously we may change it, and we may simply introduce a modification and say he handed her a scalpel and she made an incision, and then obviously the scheme as such will remain the same, but with a minor modification concerning the roles of particular agents, that is, of the participants here. Okay, so this is how the conjunction, the use of a conjunction, may reinforce and modify the schema that is a cognitive unit. Now, here we are back again to the sentences that we've already discussed. It's summer in England and it's winter in New Zealand. Max can't read and he's a linguist, so they are repeated for the second time. As you can see here, they've been repeated simply again to show that there are certain additional effects following the use of a conjunction, in contrast to these two sentences processed separately. Now, if we are back to what we've said about discus connectives, and if you remember what we've said about so you see, that so you see in fact signals an answer to the preceding question. This question might be implicit or might be explicit. Now, if there is something like a question, answer question, then definitely they constitute two separate units of processing. Okay? So in that respect, they are different to a conjunction. So now we can perhaps derive a general conclusion. If it is correct that a conjunction is processed as a single unit for relevance, then we may better understand why explanations are excluded. One conjunct cannot function as an explanation for the state of affairs described in the other, since an explanation is the answer to a why or how come question, and questions and answers are, by their very nature, planned as separate utterances, each one satisfying the principle of relevance individually. So, if you remember, we discussed various types of explanations in the course of our previous lecture, and an explanation was always some kind of answer to a question, to a specific question. And questions and answers are separate units of processing, so two units of processing, whereas a conjunction is just one unit of processing. And that difference explains why explanation cannot be expressed, cannot be conveyed by a conjunction, because there is no place for this implicit question. So now again I would like you to consider some other examples, different examples. So these are sentences that exhibit different properties, but again the same account can be applied to these utterances. So let's just have a look at the example. Jim has a new girlfriend. He goes to New York every weekend. So we may say that Jim has a new girlfriend, and as a consequence of that he goes to New York every weekend. And then these two juxtaposed sentences are more or less equivalent to a conjunction. Jim has a new girlfriend and he goes to New York every weekend. So schematically, P, so Q, cause-consequence. And mind you that this interpretation is possible not only for the conjunction but also for two juxtaposed sentences. However, in the case of two juxtaposed sentences, it is not the only possible interpretation. It is equally possible that he goes to New York every weekend is interpreted as a premise to the conclusion that was previously derived. So Jim has a new girlfriend. He goes to New York every weekend. So if I say he goes to New York every weekend, this is to provide the addressee with the premise to my conclusion that Jim has a new girlfriend. Okay? So I've derived the conclusion on the basis of my observation that he goes to New York every weekend. I may be wrong, but this is how these two sentences may be related. So mind you that in this case the second utterance does function as some kind of explanation. It is not the same kind of explanation that we have already discussed, slightly different one, but still it is a backward causal relation. It is not the case that Jim's going to New York is the cause or reason for his having a girlfriend. Rather, it is the fact of his going that he gives the speaker grounds for her belief that Jim has a girlfriend. So it plays a causal role as a premise in the speaker's deriving the conclusion. Okay? This observation that he goes to New York every weekend makes me derive the conclusion that he must have a new girlfriend. So Jim must have a new girlfriend because he goes to New York every weekend. So that's how we interpret this particular utterance. Jim has a new girlfriend. He goes to New York every weekend. So it is some kind of explanation. So as you can see, here it is paraphrased. Jim must have a new girl because he goes to New York every weekend. So that's just the interpretation, the explicit interpretation of the juxtaposed sentences. Now, if you look at the next example, Jane has left because her son isn't here. It can be interpreted in two different ways. So either you give the reason for Jane's having left, or you provide the evidence for your belief that she has left. So in the first case we're talking about content relations, in the second case we're talking about epistemic relation. So if it is a premise for the conclusion, this is the epistemic relation because it is the reason for my belief. If it is just a description of the state of affairs in the world, then it is called the content relation. So once again, if you look below, Jane has left, her son is not here. We may say that the interpretation here is ambiguous because it may be either that Jane has left, her son is not here. So Jane has left because her son is not here, so just describing the state of affairs. Or it might be my logical conclusion. Jane has left, her son is not here, and I know that she is always wherever her son is. So if her son is not here, then Jane is not here either. She must be with her son. So this is epistemic relation. Okay, but again, that kind of relation is not possible in a conjunction. So now I suppose you see that fact explanation in its default form is not the only type of relation that is excluded from conjunction, but that is typically expressed by juxtaposed sentences. Here are some further types of relations that can be conveyed in juxtaposed sentences. For instance, generally we may call them elaboration relations, and within these elaboration relations we can again enumerate several subcategories. Mind you that different types of relations that we point to here are somehow established on the basis of the same account. That is, we simply assume that some additional question may be asked. Sometimes, well, in most cases it is an implicit question. Actually, in all cases, if we talk about juxtaposed sentences. So the question can be asked, potentially, okay? And mind you that in the case of explanation, it was why question or how come question, and now perhaps different questions can be asked. I ate somewhere nice last week. I ate at McDonald's. I ate somewhere nice last week, and I ate at McDonald's. So in a conjunction, you ate twice. You ate somewhere nice, and you ate at McDonald's. But in the case of the juxtaposed sentences, I ate somewhere nice, I ate at McDonald's, you just ate once, and it was at McDonald's. So McDonald's is co-referential with somewhere nice. So this is just a specification. This is just an example where you're more specific. You elaborate the first sentence. You ate somewhere nice last night. Where did you eat? I ate at McDonald's. Now, I met a great actress at the party. I met Vanessa Redgrave. I met a great actress at the party, and I met Vanessa Redgrave. So, in the second case, obviously, you met two actresses. One of them was Vanessa Redgrave, and the other was some kind of great actress whose name is unknown. But in the first sentence, it is just one and the same person, okay, because they are co-referential here. Now, if I say, I met a great actress at the party, the question arises, whom did you meet? I met Vanessa Redgrave, okay? So, we may conclude that if a question can be asked, okay, then it is that kind of relationship that can be conveyed in a juxtaposed sentence, but cannot be in a conjunction. So in conclusion, we may say that the second utterances in the above juxtaposed sentences have an amplifying function, and they are understood as responses to questions prompted by the first utterances. It is, where did you eat and whom did you meet? No such interpretations are possible in conjuncts. So it seems that what you can express in a conjunction is heavily restricted. So let us now perhaps study sentence types and conjunction, the relation between sentence types and conjunctions. It is interesting to note which sorts of sentence level linguistic entities can be conjoined and which cannot. So an acceptable conjunction can be formed by conjoining two sentences of the same type. But there seem to be restrictions on the mixing of types. So you may just conjoin two questions or two affirmative sentences or two imperative sentences, and such conjunctions are perfectly acceptable. But now let's just see what happens if we mix syntactic types. So, mow the lawn and I lend you my stilettos. So this is correct. So the first one is an imperative and the second one is an affirmative. So this is an acceptable sentence. Then it is, he'll be here soon and make sure dinner is ready. So again, seems acceptable. So the first one is an affirmative and the second one is an imperative. Now the next one, you will get back together and will it make you happy? Well, seems acceptable, perhaps a bit awkward, but still acceptable. So this is, as you can see, the first one is an affirmative and the second one is an interrogation. But the next one, will you be happy with him and you will have to give up your job? where the first one is just an interrogative sentence, and the second one is an affirmative sentence. Just this combination simply does not work, okay? And even less so if you look at why did he leave her and she did nag him all the time. So first is a question and then it is the answer to the question, okay? So this is not acceptable at all. So as you can see, questions and answers cannot be easily combined. So this is again to support our claim that questions and answers are separate units of processing, and this is the reason why they cannot be conjoined, because conjunction by its very nature constitutes a single unit of processing. So again, concluding, there are varying degrees of acceptability here. It looks as if question-answer conjunctions are not possible, which is what the account of the exclusion of the fact explanation interpretation of the conjunctions predicts. It may be that the only question and answer that can be accepted is interpreted as question, implicit answer, and then another affirmative statement. So R is the inferred answer to P. So will you be happy with him? You won't be, and you will have to give up your job. So will you be happy with him? No. And you will have to give up your job. Okay, so in that way, perhaps, you can somehow claim that they can be conjoined. Mind you that here the intention of the speaker is transparent. So if the speaker says, will you be happy with him? He implies that the addressee won't be happy. So the answer, this implicit answer, is evident in a way. It's very easy to derive. Will you be happy with him? And you will have to give up your job, which means you won't be happy and you will have to give up your job. But the acceptability of this sort of conjunctions drops markedly if the intended answer to the question is not immediately apparent, as in the following example. Why did the chicken cross the road? And she's such a featherbrain. Okay, so it does not make much sense here. So why did the chicken cross the road? And she's such a featherbrain, because you do not know this implicit answer to the question here. So it cannot be accepted, that kind of conjunction. So if these observations are right, there is a general restriction on the conjoining of an interrogative and declarative. Okay? Will you be happy with him? And you will have to give up your job. So and here's sentence initial. It is not the continuation of the previous one. Okay, it is not the second conjunct, as if it does not introduce a second conjunct. So now perhaps we can proceed to our final conclusion. So the single processing unit nature of conjunction, coupled with the observation that in various of the juxtaposed cases the second utterance appears to be answering an implicit question raised by the first, provide the ingredients for an account of why so many of these relations cannot be communicated by a conjoined utterance. Okay? A conjoined utterance is a single processing unit. Explanation involves question and answer. Thus, explanation involves two independent processing units. Therefore, explanation cannot be conveyed in a conjunction. So we may conclude that fact explanation is the most common sort of superordinate type of relation that arises in juxtaposed sentences. We also mentioned some other elaboration relations, and here are some further examples. So other relations possible for juxtaposed cases but excluded from conjunction: exemplification and restatement or reformulation. So restatement is just understood as reformulation. So let's just have a look at the first one. Wars are breaking out all over. X and Y have begun having border skirmishes. So this is exemplification. Okay. Or language is rule governed. It follows regular patterns. So this is reformulation or restatement. Mind you that if these two sentences are conjoined by and, then the relations of exemplification or reformulation simply do not arise. Wars are breaking out all over and X and Y have begun having border skirmishes. Language is rule governed and it follows regular patterns. So it's a completely different thing. So two features of language, but not that language is rule governed, which means that it follows regular patterns. Another possible relation, specification. Again, exemplification of some kind. Your behavior bothers me. You come drunk and insult the waiter. Okay, so your behavior bothers me. Mind you that again you can ask a question. So you can ask a question, what in particular bothers you? Why? So you come drunk and you insult the waiter. Karen is photogenic. She has a really brilliant smile. Okay, so in what way is Karen photogenic? What does it mean that she is photogenic? So the second utterance can be understood as answering an anticipated question. Where are wars breaking out? What does it mean that language is rule governed? What's the problem with my behavior? In what respect is she photogenic? So let us perhaps take one more look at reformulations, because they are in a way different than the remaining types of relations that we have been discussing. So the second utterance in the reformulation is the interpretation or the restatement. So you remember the example, language is rule governed, it follows regular patterns. Mind you that this relation between two juxtaposed sentences may be signaled explicitly. So there are certain discourse markers, discourse connectives, that signal that what follows is a restatement. So these discourse connectives are conceptual, not procedural, and their function is to tell the hearer that the utterance they preface is a representation of a preceding utterance, rather than a description of the state of affairs. So these are that is, or in other words, or in short. So such reformulations may be treated as formal explanations of meaning. So instead of saying language is rule governed, it follows regular patterns, we may say language is rule governed. In other words, it follows regular patterns, or that is, it follows regular patterns. So the same function can be, as you can see, performed explicitly. Now let us have a look at exemplification and logical consequence. So I always pick the wrong cue. Yesterday I ended up waiting a quarter of an hour to get to the checkout. Mind you that this relation disappears if we conjoin the utterances. I always pick the wrong cue, and yesterday I ended up waiting a quarter of an hour to get to the checkout. So in the case of exemplification, we provide evidence. We bring the assumption that something is typical. To make a claim and then to present evidence for it is to produce two utterances. So each of which carries the presumption of relevance individually. So again, you can notice that this relation can arise exclusively in juxtaposed sentences, because by the very nature, this relation is conveyed in terms of two different individual propositions. You make a claim and then you present evidence. So two different individual utterances, independent in a way. Okay, so two units of processing. And then logical consequence. There are his footsteps. He has been here recently. There are his footsteps, and he's been here, and he's been here recently. Obviously, if we conjoin the two utterances, the relation does not arise. So again, the same kind of reasoning. First you notice something, this is your observation, the statement of the fact, and then you provide the premise for that, the justification for that. You make a claim and then present some kind of evidence. So in a way, this relationship is similar to the one that we've just discussed. So again, two different utterances, and in each of these utterances carries the presumption of relevance individually, so has to be processed on its own. Perhaps you remember what we've said about cognitive schemas, cognitive units, when we were talking about conjunctions, that there are certain ready-made scenarios out there in the world, and we just refer to these scenarios and reinforce these scenarios when using conjoined utterances. And now I would like one more time to be back to conjunctions and juxtaposed sentences, and I want you to notice that the relations that they express are different in one more aspect. So the relations that we have just discussed, such as logical consequence or exemplification or reformulation or specification or whatever, so such relations that do not arise in conjuncts share one property. They are not relations out there in the world. They are relations that hold only in our minds. Perhaps you remember these examples that involved epistemic relations. That is, again, fact and then what makes us think so. Okay, so the reason for our belief that it is so. So this is what is happening in our mind. So these are relations between representations, or in other words, between our thoughts, between our computations, so to say. On the other hand, the temporal and cause-consequence relations, which may hold between conjuncts and that represent this cognitive schemas or cognitive units, are very much out there. Okay, so they do occur in the real world. We simply register them perceptually and represent them in our factual beliefs. So I hope that you can notice this dramatic difference between these two types of relations, and then you may notice that relations that arise in juxtaposed cases are sort of mental relations. So we may say that they are meta-relations, because they just hold in our minds, that they are products of our minds, whereas cause-consequence and temporal relations are, let's say, relations existing in the real world. So perhaps this dichotomous division can also somehow account for the fact that certain relations are excluded from conjunctions. Thank you for your attention.